I'm Nora. I'm 31. And the night before my divorce was finalized, my husband's family threw me a goodbye dinner. Not a sad one. Not the kind where people cry into their wine and say they'll miss you. The kind where the tablecloth is pressed and the good china comes out and everyone smiles a little too carefully, the way people smile when they have already decided something and are waiting for you to catch up. My mother-in-law Margaret had made her pot roast. My father-in-law had opened a bottle he'd been saving. My sister-in-law had brought a card that said, in her own handwriting on the inside, "Wishing you well in your next chapter." My next chapter. I sat at that table for 2 hours and ate the pot roast and thanked Margaret for the recipe and listened to my father-in-law talk about the weather. And I did not say the thing I knew, the thing I had known for 11 days, the thing that was sitting in a sealed folder in the glove compartment of my car in their driveway while we passed the bread and said, "Please and thank you," and talked about everything except the fact that this dinner was not a goodbye. It was a celebration. And they had invited the wrong person to it. I should start from the beginning. I met Connor Whitfield when I was 24 years old at a conference for mid-sized accounting firms, where we were both the youngest people in every room and bonded over bad coffee and the particular exhaustion of pretending to network. He was funny in the specific way of someone who is actually smart, rather than someone who has learned to seem smart. And he had the kind of laugh that made you want to say something worth laughing at. I fell for him in the way you fall for someone when you are 24, and the world still feels like it is mostly made of possibility. We dated for 2 years. We got engaged. We got married in a backyard ceremony in September with 40 people and string lights and a cake my best friend Donna made herself because she is that kind of friend. I wore my grandmother's earrings, and Connor cried a little when I walked toward him, and I thought, standing there in the September light, that this was the shape my life was going to take. I was not wrong that it was a shape. I was wrong that it was the permanent one. The Whitfields were a family with a specific architecture. Margaret ran the house and everything adjacent to it with the particular efficiency of a woman who had decided long ago that managing people was a form of love and had never been told otherwise. My father-in-law Richard was quieter, a man who expressed approval through presence and disapproval through absence, and whose silences I had spent 6 years learning to read. Connor's sister Blythe was 3 years younger and had the family loyalty of someone who had grown up understanding that loyalty was the price of belonging. I had tried. I want to say that clearly because it matters. I had shown up to every holiday and every birthday and every Sunday dinner for 6 years with the particular effort of a woman who understands. She is being assessed and has decided to pass the assessment through sheer consistency. I had learned Margaret's recipes. I had asked Richard about his garden. I had driven Blythe to the airport at 5 in the morning when her flight was early and her husband was traveling. I had tried. What I had not understood for the first 4 years of my marriage was that trying was not the same as belonging. That there was a version of the Whitfield family that included me, and a version that did not, and that the difference between those two versions had nothing to do with Margaret's pot roast or Richard's garden or Blythe's early morning flights. It had to do with the house. The house on Carteret Lane was the thing I need to tell you about because without the house, none of the rest of this makes sense. Connor and I bought it in year 3 of our marriage. A colonial on a quiet street with a yard that needed work and a kitchen that needed updating, and enough space to feel like a future rather than a holding pattern. We bought it together. We signed the mortgage together. We spent the first summer painting every room a color we argued about and then agreed on, and I thought, rolling paint onto the walls of what would become our bedroom, that this was the specific texture of building something with another person. Imperfect and loud and entirely ours. What happened over the next 3 years was not one thing. It was the accumulation of small things that individually meant nothing, and together meant the end of a marriage. Connor's work expanded, and my work expanded, and the space between us expanded along with them in the particular quiet way that space expands between two people who are too busy and too proud to name what is happening. We were not cruel to each other. We were not dramatic. We were simply two people who had grown into shapes that no longer fit the same space. We separated in February. Mutually, which is a word that covers a great deal of complexity in a single syllable. We had been in couples therapy for 8 months, and our therapist had said, in her measured and careful way, that sometimes two people can do everything right and still arrive at a place where the most honest thing is to stop. Connor and I looked at each other across her office and understood simultaneously that we had arrived at that place. Welcome back to Silent Justice Stories. Quiet, true-to-life tales about ordinary women who keep their composure when family turns on them and who win by knowing exactly what they're worth. If boundaries and earned justice are why you're here, drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. The separation was civil. That is the word I keep returning to. Civil. We divided the things that were easy to divide and left the house as an open question, because the house was not easy, and we were both too tired to fight about it in February when there was still snow on the ground, and the grief of it was still raw enough that every conversation required more than we had. Connor moved into an apartment. I stayed in the house on Carteret Lane because I was the one who had painted the rooms and learned where the heat was uneven and which window stuck in winter, and how to reset the circuit breaker when the kitchen overloaded. I stayed because it felt, in some way I could not fully articulate in February, like the house knew me in a way that required acknowledgement. The Whitfields had opinions about this, not stated ones. The Whitfields did not state opinions directly. They had a way of communicating through atmosphere, through the particular temperature of a phone call or the specific timing of a visit, that conveyed position without ever requiring anyone to defend one. Margaret called me in March, warm and careful, to ask how I was doing. She called Connor in March, and I knew from the way he mentioned it that her call to him had lasted longer and covered different ground. Richard stopped responding to my texts about a shared subscription we had asked him to manage. Blythe, who had once texted me memes on Tuesday afternoons for no reason, went quiet in the specific way of someone who has been asked to go quiet. I noticed all of it. I filed it the way I file things, not with anger, with attention. In April, my attorney, a woman named Susan Gareth, who had the calm precision of someone who had seen every version of this situation and had stopped being surprised by any of them, sat across from me and laid out the options regarding the house. She explained what a contested asset meant in our state. She explained what my contribution to the mortgage and the renovation costs meant legally. She explained what Connor's family's expectations, however loudly or quietly held, meant in a court of law. She said, "They mean nothing." Then she said something else. She said there is another option that people in your position sometimes do not know is available to them. She slid a document across the desk. I read it. I read it again. Then I looked up at her and I said, "Is this actually possible?" She said, "It requires his agreement and it requires specific timing. But yes, it is possible." I said, "What does it cost?" She said, "Considerably less than a contested divorce." I said, "How long do I have to decide?" She said, "The window closes when the final papers are filed. After that, it becomes a different and more complicated conversation." I drove home from Susan's office on a Thursday afternoon in April, and I sat in the kitchen of the house on Carteret Lane, and I looked at the walls I had painted and the floors we had refinished and the window that stuck in winter, and I thought about what Susan had said. About the window. About the timing. About what was possible if the right people agreed to the right things at the right moment. Then I made a phone call, not to Connor, not yet, to Donna, because Donna is the person I call when I need to think out loud with someone who will not tell me what to do but will ask exactly the right questions until I figure out what I already know. She asked 3 questions. The third one was, "What does the house mean to you?" Not what is it worth. What does it mean? I sat with that for a long time. Then I called. Connor answered on the second ring the way he always answered, which was immediately because Connor was a person who picked up his phone the way other people open doors, without hesitation, without checking who it was first, with the assumption that whoever was calling had a reason worth hearing. It was one of the things I had loved about him, and one of the things that made the distance between us feel more specific. Because you can love a quality in a person and still understand that the person and their qualities are no longer the right fit for your life. I said, "I need to talk to you about the house." He said, "Okay." I said, "Not on the phone." "Can you come over this week?" He said, "Thursday evening?" I said, "Thursday is fine." He came on Thursday with a bottle of wine he set on the counter without opening, because that was the kind of man Connor was. The kind who brought wine to difficult conversations not because he planned to drink it, but because arriving empty-handed to the house where he used to live felt wrong in a way he couldn't name. I made tea. We sat at the kitchen table that we had carried up 2 flights of stairs together on a rented dolly the summer we moved in, both of us laughing at how badly we had underestimated its weight. I told him what Susan had said. Not all of it. The relevant part. The part about the option. The part about the window. The part about what was possible if we agreed. Connor listened the way he listened to things that required real attention, with his hands flat on the table and his eyes on me, not on the middle distance, but on me, which was something I had always respected about him even when we were at our worst. When I finished, he said, "And you want this?" I said, "I want to know if it's something we can agree on." He said, "Walk me through what it means for me." I did. Susan had been clear, and I repeated her clarity as accurately as I could. What Connor would keep. What I would take on. What the numbers looked like from his side of the table. It was not an unfair arrangement. Susan had been careful about that because Susan understood that the arrangements that hold up are the ones that both people can look at and see themselves being treated honestly. Connor was quiet for a while. He looked at the kitchen, at the walls, at the window that stuck in winter that he had tried to fix 3 times and never quite managed. He looked at the table we had carried up 2 flights on a rented dolly and laughed about. He said, "You want to stay here?" I said, "Yes." He said, "You've always wanted to stay here." I said, "Yes." He said, "I know." He was quiet again. Then he said, "I need a few days." I said, "Susan says the window is 3 weeks." He said, "I only need a few days." He called me on a Sunday. He said yes. I want to be honest with you about what I felt when he said yes because I think the honesty matters. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel like I had won something. I felt something quieter and more complicated, the particular feeling of a chapter ending in a way that was sad and right simultaneously, the way things can be both sad and right without either quality canceling the other. Connor and I had built something together in this house, and what we had built was real, and what it had become was no longer enough for either of us, and the fact that I was staying in the house and he was not, did not change any of that. I said, "Thank you, Connor." He said, "Take care of the window." I almost laughed. I said, "I will." Susan filed the paperwork the following week. The arrangement was documented correctly and completely, the way Susan did everything, and the deed to the house on Carteret Lane was processed in my name. Solely my name. Not because Connor had been cheated or pressured or manipulated, but because he had looked at the numbers and looked at what each of us needed and agreed that this was fair. The mortgage refinancing would take a few weeks to finalize, but the deed itself was done in 11 days. 11 days before the goodbye dinner, I did not tell the Whitfields, not because I was hiding something, not because I was planning anything, but because the Whitfields were Connor's family, and this was Connor's information to share on his own timeline and in his own way. I was not going to manage that communication for him. I had spent 6 years managing things I did not need to manage in that family, and I had decided in February, quietly and without announcement, that I was finished doing that. What I did not know, and what I understand now looking back, was that Connor had not told them either. Not because he was hiding it, because Connor was a person who processed things privately before he shared them, and he had not yet processed this one enough to share it. Which meant that when Margaret called me in early May with the sweet, careful voice she used when she had decided something and invited me to dinner the following Friday and described it as a chance for us all to say goodbye properly before everything was finalized, she was operating on a version of reality that had already been replaced by a different one. She thought the house was still in play. She thought I was leaving. She thought the dinner was a send-off. My first instinct was to say no. I want to be honest about that. My first instinct was to tell Margaret that I appreciated the thought and that I wished them all well, and that a dinner was not something I had the capacity for right now. That would have been the clean choice, the simple one. But something stopped me. Not calculation, not planning. Just a quiet understanding that sometimes you have to sit at the table to understand the full shape of what has been happening around you. I had spent 6 years not fully understanding the shape of what was happening around me in that family. I thought one more dinner might finally show me. I said, "I'd love to come, Margaret. Thank you." She said, "Wonderful. 7 o'clock, I'm making the pot roast." Of course she was making the pot roast. I spent the week before the dinner working and not thinking about the dinner, which is a thing I am good at. The compartmentalization that 11 years of emergency nursing builds in you, whether you want it or not. A patient comes in and you are present for the patient. A form needs filing and you are present for the form. The dinner on Friday is a thing that exists in a separate room of your mind, and you close the door on it until Friday arrives. Friday arrived. I drove to the Whitfield house in the early evening light. May light. The particular gold of it that makes even ordinary streets look briefly significant. I had the sealed folder from Susan in my glove compartment, not because I planned to produce it, but because I had put it there 11 days ago and had not moved it, and somehow that morning, getting ready, it had felt wrong to leave it behind. Not for any reason I could have named. Just a feeling. The steady kind. The house smelled like it always smelled. Like pot roast and something floral Margaret kept on the entryway table, and the specific warmth of a house that has been lived in by the same people for a long time. Richard took my coat. Blythe hugged me with the careful warmth of someone who has been told to be kind and is doing their best with the instruction. Margaret came from the kitchen and held my hands and said, "You look wonderful, Nora." And I thanked her and meant it in the way you mean compliments that are both genuine and beside the point. We sat down to dinner. The pot roast was as good as it always was. The wine Richard had opened was better than the usual Sunday bottle, which told me something about what this evening meant to them. There was a quality of occasion in the room, a slight formality underneath the warmth. The pressed tablecloth, the good china. Blythe's card sitting on the sideboard, which I had seen when I came in and read without picking up, wishing you well in your next chapter, in her own handwriting with a little drawing of a door in the corner that I thought was probably meant to be hopeful and landed as something else. Connor was not there. I had not expected him to be, and he was not. We talked about Blythe's children. We talked about Richard's garden. The tomatoes were in. The beans were doing something unexpected. We talked about Margaret's book club and a trip they were planning in the fall. We talked about everything except the thing the dinner was about, which is how the Whitfields always talked, moving around the center of a thing in widening circles until the center became obvious by being the only place nobody had gone. Halfway through the main course, Margaret set down her fork and folded her hands on the table in the specific way she folded them when she was about to say something she had decided in advance. She said, "Nora, we want you to know that whatever happens with the house, we hope you know this family has always cared about you." I said, "I appreciate that, Margaret." She said, "Connor mentioned you two are still working through the details of the property." I said, "We've worked through them." She said, "We just want to make sure you're being looked after, that whatever settlement comes out of this is fair to you." And there it was. Not cruel, not obvious. Just the careful concern of a family that had decided that fair to me meant less than what I had and was offering to be gracious about the gap. Richard said, "We've spoken to an attorney as well, just to understand the landscape." Blythe said, "We just want everything to be clean for everyone." I looked at the three of them, Margaret with her folded hands, Richard with his measured tone, Blythe with her careful warmth, and her card on the sideboard with the little door in the corner. They had spoken to an attorney. They had been planning. The dinner was not just a send-off. It was a positioning, a way of establishing before the final papers were filed that they were present and paying attention, and that what happened to the house on Carteret Lane was something they considered their concern. I picked up my wine glass. I took a sip. I set it down. I said, "I think everything is already clean." Margaret said, "Well, these things have a way of getting complicated at the last minute." I said, "I don't think this one will." She smiled. The smile of a woman who has been doing this longer than I have and believes patience is on her side. Stay with me. I promise the part where it turns is worth every minute. And if a calm woman finally being underestimated is your kind of story, hit subscribe so you don't miss how it ends. We finished the pot roast. We had dessert. Margaret's lemon cake, the recipe she had never given me in 6 years of asking, which I had stopped asking for 2 years ago when I understood it was not going to be given. We drank coffee, and Richard told a long story about the tomatoes, and Blythe talked about her youngest, and I sat in the warm kitchen light and felt the folder in my glove compartment the way you feel something you know is true when the people around you are operating on something that isn't. At the end of the evening, I helped clear the plates because that is what I do. I thanked Margaret for the pot roast. I told Richard the tomatoes sounded wonderful. I hugged Blythe and said, "Take care of yourself." I collected my coat from the hook in the entryway. At the front door, Margaret took my hand and said, "Nora, whatever happens, I hope you know there are no hard feelings." I said, "I appreciate that, Margaret. I'll be in touch." I walked to my car in the May evening. I got in. I sat for a moment with my hands on the wheel. Then I reached into the glove compartment and I took out the sealed folder, and I held it in my hands, and I thought about what no hard feelings meant, and what it was meant to accomplish, and what it would mean on Monday when Susan filed the final papers, and the deed that was already in my name became the publicly recorded fact of the situation. I put the folder back. I started the car. I drove home to the house on Carteret Lane. I had 11 days of knowing something they did not know, and I had sat at their table and eaten their pot roast and listened to their careful positioning, and I had felt, for the first time in 6 years at that table, entirely calm. Not because I was hiding something, because I was the one person in that room who already knew how the story ended. Monday came the way Mondays come when you have been waiting for them. Without ceremony, without announcement, just the ordinary arrival of a day that happens to contain something significant. I was at the hospital by 6 for a double shift that had been on the schedule for 3 weeks, and that I had not asked to reschedule because work was the thing that kept me level, and level was what I needed to be. Susan called at 11:17 while I was on a break in the staff room with a cup of coffee I had not had time to drink. She said, "It's done. The final filing went through this morning. The deed is recorded. The house is yours, Nora. Sole ownership. Congratulations." I said, "Thank you, Susan." She said, "You handled this well." I said, "You handled it well. I just showed up." She laughed a little. She said, "That's usually the harder part." I finished my shift at 7 in the evening and drove home to the house on Carteret Lane in the blue late light of a May Monday, and let myself in through the front door and stood in the hallway for a moment in the quiet. The house had the particular quality of a place that knows it has been decided. Not different. Just settled. The way a room feels after a long conversation that has finally arrived at the truth of what it needed to say. I made dinner. I ate it at the kitchen table. I did not check my phone because I knew what was coming and I wanted one evening of not yet. Connor had been notified through Susan's counterpart on his side. That was the arrangement, and it was the right arrangement. The Whitfields, I assumed, would find out from Connor. When he told them was his business. How he told them was his business. I had been very clear with myself about that boundary, and I intended to keep it. The first call came Tuesday morning at 8:42. Not from Connor, from Margaret. I was in the car outside the grocery store and I saw her name on the screen, and I let it ring through to voicemail because I was not ready to have that conversation from a parking lot. She left a message that was 2 minutes long and had the specific quality of a woman who had prepared something and then abandoned the preparation halfway through when the feelings overtook the script. She said she had spoken to Connor. She said she was confused. She said she thought we had all agreed that the property situation was still being worked out. She said she hoped there had not been a misunderstanding. She said, "Please call me back, Nora." Misunderstanding. That was the word she chose. Not betrayal, not deception. Misunderstanding. As if what had happened was a failure of communication rather than a legal process that had proceeded exactly as designed with everyone's full knowledge and consent. I sat in the parking lot for a moment. Then I went into the grocery store and bought what I had come for and drove home and put everything away and made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table and called Margaret back. She answered immediately. She said, "Nora, thank you for calling." I said, "Of course, Margaret." She said, "I spoke with Connor and he explained what happened with the paperwork." I said, "What did he tell you?" She said, "He said the house has been put in your name. Just your name." I said, "That's correct." She said, "And he agreed to this." I said, "He did." She was quiet for a moment. The quiet of someone who has received information that conflicts with a story they have been telling themselves and is deciding in real time which one to keep. She said, "Nora, I have to be honest with you. We feel blindsided." I said, "I understand that." She said, "We thought the property was still something that was being negotiated. We had no idea this had already been decided." I said, "It was decided between Connor and me with our attorneys. That's how these things work, Margaret." She said, "We have a stake in this too. That house is part of our family." I want to tell you about that sentence because I have thought about it many times since. That house is part of our family. Not your house, our family's house. The quiet assumption of it. The way it arrived not as a claim, but as a fact, stated plainly, as if it had always been true, and I had simply failed to understand it. I said, "The house is mine, Margaret. Connor and I agreed on that, and it's been legally processed." She said, "I think we need to have a conversation about this as a family." I said, "The legal part of this conversation is finished." She said, "I'm not talking about legal. I'm talking about what's right." I said, "I think what Connor and I agreed to is what's right." She said, "Nora, you have to understand that from where we're sitting, this looks very different than what you're describing." I said, "I'm sure it does." She said, "We're going to need some time to process this." I said, "Of course. Take all the time you need." I said it without irony. I meant it genuinely. They did need time. What they needed time for was to arrive at the understanding that the time for a different outcome had already passed, and that arrival would take however long it took, and there was nothing I could do to speed it or slow it, and nothing I needed to do. I said, "Margaret, I hope you know I have always respected your family. This was a legal decision between two adults, and it was made honestly. I wish you all well." She said, "I'm sure you do." She hung up. I sat with my tea, and I thought about the pot roast and the good wine and Blythe's card on the sideboard and the little door drawn in the corner that was probably meant to be hopeful, "Wishing you well in your next chapter." They had written that card believing the next chapter was somewhere else, somewhere smaller. Somewhere that was not the house on Carteret Lane, with its stuck winter window and its refinished floors and the kitchen walls painted a color we had argued about and then agreed on. The calls continued for the rest of that week. Blythe called on Wednesday, and her voice had the quality of someone performing hurt rather than feeling it, the hurt that arrives when a plan does not work, rather than the hurt that arrives when something genuinely wounds you. She said, "I just think you could have been more transparent with us, Nora." I said, "I was transparent with Connor. He's your family." She said, "You know what I mean." I said, "I think you mean you wish the outcome had been different." She said, "That's not fair." I said, "I think it is." Richard did not call. That was Richard's way. He expressed disapproval through absence, and his absence was loud enough that I felt it without needing the phone call. Connor called on Thursday evening. His voice was tired in the way it got when he had been having the same conversation too many times. He said, "My family is upset." I said, "I know." He said, "I told them it was my decision and mine to make." I said, "Thank you." He said, "I need you to know I don't regret it." I said, "I know." He said, "The house belongs to you. It always fit you better than it fit me." I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "I'll take care of the window." He said, "I know you will." That was the last real conversation Connor and I had about the house. What came after that was the quieter work of the Whitfields processing something they had not expected and arriving slowly at the understanding that there was nothing to be done about it. Margaret sent me a text 2 weeks later that said simply, "I hope you're well." I replied, "I hope you are too." That was the extent of it. The calls stopped. The silence replaced them. The particular silence of people who have run out of arguments and are deciding whether to accept a situation or keep fighting it. They accepted it. Not warmly, not with grace exactly, but with the practical resignation of people who have spoken to their own attorney, as Richard had mentioned at the dinner and been told what Susan had already told me, that the arrangement was legal and documented and complete. I want to be honest with you about something because I think this story only makes sense if I say this part clearly. I did not plan the dinner. I did not orchestrate it. I did not sit at Margaret's table eating her pot roast and thinking about how satisfying this moment would eventually be. I sat at that table because I was invited and because I thought going might help me understand something, and because I had spent 6 years showing up for that family, and one more evening did not feel like more than I could manage. What I had not anticipated was how much the dinner would clarify. Not for me. For them. Because by inviting me to a goodbye dinner the night before the paperwork was finalized, they had shown me, without meaning to, exactly what they had expected to happen and exactly what I meant to them in the accounting of the situation. A person to be wished well on her way out. A chapter that was ending. A door that the card on the sideboard had already drawn. What I had not told them, because it was not mine to tell over pot roast and good wine, was that the door was not the one they had drawn. It was the front door of the house on Cartwright Lane, and I was the one with the key. If you've ever had your own family mistake your silence for surrender, then you already know exactly what I felt in those weeks. Stay with me. I promise the part where it turns is worth every minute. And if a calm woman finally being underestimated is your kind of story, hit subscribe so you don't miss how it ends. The weeks after the filing had a different quality than the weeks before it. Before, I had been carrying something. The knowledge, the folder in the glove compartment. The 11 days of knowing something that the people around me did not know. That carrying had been lighter than I expected, lighter than grief, lighter than anger, lighter than the 6 years of trying to belong to a family that had a specific idea of what belonging meant and had never quite extended that idea to include me. After the filing, the carrying was done, and what replaced it was something I had not felt in a long time. Space. The particular spaciousness of a life that has been simplified by honesty. Connor and I had been honest with each other at the kitchen table on a Thursday evening over unopened wine. Susan had been honest with me in her downtown office with the good coffee in the waiting room. I had been honest with Margaret on the phone on a Tuesday morning from my own kitchen. The honesty had cost something. All honesty costs something. But what it had purchased was a clarity I had not had in years. I was 31 years old and I owned a house on Cartwright Lane with a window that stuck in winter, and floors I had refinished myself and walls painted a color I had argued about and then loved. I had a job I was good at, and a best friend who made wedding cakes and asked the right questions, and a life that was mine in a way it had not been for a long time. I was not certain what came next. I am still not certain of all of it. But I was certain of the house, and the house was enough to start with. The summer that followed was the quietest I had spent in years, not empty. Quiet in the specific way of a life that has been stripped of something that was taking up more space than it was worth, and has not yet filled that space with something new and is learning that unfilled space is not the same as absence. That it can be, if you let it, a kind of rest. I painted the bedroom again. Not because it needed it. Because I wanted to choose the color alone this time, without negotiation, without compromise, without the particular arithmetic of two people arriving at a decision together. I stood in the paint aisle of the hardware store for 40 minutes and chose a color called slate morning that I would not have chosen with anyone else in the room, and I brought it home and painted every wall myself on a Saturday in June with the windows open and music I liked at a volume I liked, and I did not ask anyone's opinion about any of it. The window that stuck in winter I finally fixed in July. Not Connor's way, which had involved 3 attempts and a level of optimism about the frame that the frame had never warranted. I called a carpenter named Ellis who charged me a fair price and fixed it in 90 minutes and showed me exactly what he had done so I could maintain it myself. He said, "Previous owner try to fix this himself?" I said, "Something like that." He said, "Not a carpenter." I said, "No, he was an accountant." Ellis laughed. I paid him and thanked him and closed the window and opened it again twice just to feel how easily it moved. Donna came over on a Friday evening in August with a bottle of wine and the particular energy of a best friend who has been patient through a long, hard chapter and is ready to celebrate the ending of it. We sat on the back porch in the late summer heat and she asked me how I was. "Really?" she said. Not, "How are you" as a greeting, but "How are you" as an actual question. I thought about it honestly before I answered, which is a thing I do not always do and should do more. I said, "I think I'm okay. I think I'm more than okay, actually. I think I'm somewhere I recognize." She said, "The house." I said, "Partly the house, partly something else. I think I spent a long time trying to fit into a shape that was made for someone else, and I got so good at trying that I forgot the trying was costing me something. And now I'm not trying and I notice the difference." She said, "What does the difference feel like?" I said, "Like the window. Like something that was stuck finally moving the way it was supposed to." She topped up my wine. She said, "I'm proud of you." I said, "I didn't do anything dramatic." She said, "You did the hard kind, the quiet kind." I thought about that for a long time after she left. The hard kind, the quiet kind, because that is what it had been. Not a confrontation, not a scene. Not the version of this story where someone slams a folder on a table and delivers a speech. Just a woman who knew something and said nothing and waited and let the truth of it arrive in its own time in the most irrefutable form available, which is a legal document recorded with the county. Margaret texted me in September. It had been 4 months since the pot roast dinner and 2 months since the "I hope you're well" exchange, and I had not expected to hear from her again for a while, if ever. The text said, "Nora, I've been thinking. I'd like to talk if you're open to it. Not about the house, about everything else." I sat with that text for 2 days before I responded. Not because I was angry, not because I was strategizing, but because I wanted to be honest with myself about what I wanted from a conversation with Margaret Whitfield before I walked into one. I had spent 6 years walking into conversations with Margaret without being honest with myself about what I wanted from them, and the result had been 6 years of leaving those conversations feeling like I had performed adequately rather than said anything true. I texted back, "I'm open to it." "Coffee next week?" She said, "Tuesday at 11 if that works." I said, "Tuesday works." We met at a cafe downtown, neutral ground, the kind of place with good coffee and enough ambient noise that difficult conversations have somewhere to go besides straight at each other. Margaret was there when I arrived, already seated, already holding her cup in both hands the way she held things she was not sure about. She looked older than she had at the dinner, not dramatically. Just the particular aging that happens to a person's face when they have spent several months revising something they thought they understood. She said, "Thank you for coming." I said, "Of course." She said, "I'm not going to pretend I wasn't angry." I said, "I know you were." She said, "I'm also not going to pretend that the anger was entirely fair." I said nothing. I let her have the space to say what she had come to say. She said, "Richard and I have been married for 38 years, and in 38 years I have watched him approach every difficult situation by deciding what the outcome should be and then working backward from there. I have done the same thing. It is how we operate. And it works most of the time." She paused. It did not work here because we made a decision about what the outcome of your marriage should be without understanding what had actually happened in it. And then we had a dinner to celebrate an outcome that had already been replaced by a different one. She picked up her coffee. That is embarrassing to say out loud. I said, I understand why you operated the way you did. She said, You're being more generous than I was. I said, I had 6 years of practice understanding how your family operates. That gives me some perspective. She said, Did you ever feel like you belonged with us? The question arrived without warning, and I sat with it for a moment because it deserved a real answer rather than a careful one. I said, I felt like I was trying to belong. I'm not sure that's the same thing. She said, No, I don't think it is. She looked out the window for a moment. Then she said, Connor is doing well. I don't know if you want to know that. I said, I do want to know that. I'm glad. She said, He seems lighter. He says the same about you. I said, We were better at being honest with each other at the end than we were in the middle. I think that's the best version of how something like this can go. She nodded. She said, I think I owe you an apology for the dinner, for what it was meant to be. We thought we were helping Connor, and instead we were just deciding things that were not ours to decide. I said, I appreciate you saying that, Margaret. She said, I'm not asking for anything. I want you to know that. I'm not asking to stay in your life or to repair something that is probably too complicated to repair. I just wanted to say it because it needed to be said. I looked at her across the cafe table, and I thought about 6 years of Sunday dinners and the pot roast recipe she had never given me in Blythe's card with the little door in the corner, and the good wine Richard had opened for a goodbye that turned out to be something else entirely. I thought about what it had cost to sit at that table and say nothing and drive home with the folder in the glove compartment and wait. I said, I accept your apology, Margaret. And for what it's worth, I don't think you're a bad person. I think you love your family the way you know how to love them. That's not nothing. She said it's not enough sometimes. I said no, sometimes it isn't. We finished our coffee. We talked about small things for a few minutes. The cafe, the neighborhood, a restaurant she had been to recently that was worth trying. The kind of conversation that exists in the space after the important one has finished, and neither person is quite ready to leave. Then we stood, and she put on her coat, and she looked at me and said, Take care of yourself, Nora. I said, You too, Margaret. We did not hug. That was right. Some things cannot be rushed back to and should not be. I walked out into the September morning and stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the early autumn light, and I thought about what she had said. That she was not asking for anything. That she just wanted to say it because it needed to be said. I understood that. I had spent the past several months learning the specific value of saying things because they needed to be said, rather than because they would produce a particular outcome. It was a harder way to operate than working backward from a desired result. It was also more honest. And honesty, I had learned, was the only thing that actually held up. I drove home to the house on Carteret Lane. The leaves were beginning to turn, just barely. Just the first suggestion of it at the edges of things. I parked in the driveway and sat for a moment before going in. The house looked the way it always looked from the outside, a 1920s colonial on a quiet street that everyone had once told us to bulldoze, which we had not. The paint was the color we had argued about and then agreed on, and which I had not changed because it turned out I liked it, had always liked it, had agreed to it, not because I was compromising, but because it was actually right. I let myself in through the front door. The house was quiet and full of itself the way it had been since February, the particular inhabited quality of a space that knows who lives in it. I went to the kitchen and put the kettle on and stood at the window while it heated and looked out at the yard that still needed work, the yard that would always need work. The yard I was going to spend the next several years learning to understand the way I had learned to understand everything else about this place. Slowly, honestly, on my own terms. The kettle boiled. I made my tea. I sat at the kitchen table in the autumn light And I thought about a goodbye dinner in May, and a folder in a glove compartment, and a window that finally moved the way it was supposed to, and a woman named Susan who had said the arrangements that hold up are the ones that both people can look at and see themselves being treated honestly. I had been treated honestly, I had treated others honestly. The arrangement had held up. I was 31 years old and I was home. That was enough. That was exactly enough. Stories are adapted from real Reddit posts.